Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be looking at the potential of former President Donald Trump's chances of becoming the next president of the United States. Before we get to the charts, I just wanted to share a clip with you, which you may have seen before in the previous video, when I said back in July 2020 that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States, but he would not be running against Donald Trump in the 2024 election. And I'll share that clip here. So part of my prediction is, and what I think will happen, is that Joe Biden will win the election. He will, try and get a steady hand on the wheel, have people around him. But what I think will happen is I don't think he will even go for a second term. So whether this is maybe a cognitive decline, health issue, I believe someone else will probably take the mantle and that he won't look for a second term. Okay, so before we get into the charts, I just want to reiterate what I mentioned in the previous video, that some of the issues with political predictive work is that you have to take into account the lens that the astrologer is looking through and any biases they may have. And also to point out that any views I express today may not be shared by KeplerCollege. Okay, so the first chart we're going to look at today is Donald Trump's natal chart. Fortunately, we have an AA rating, as we did with Kamala Harris, which is essential in any predictive work. Now, I'm not going to speak at length about Donald Trump's natal chart. We are all familiar with who he is. As many of you will know, one of the most striking connections in this chart is his Mars conjunct the ascendant. That Mars is fairly strong, it's direct, it's conjunct an angle, it's in its own terms, pretty much setting its own agenda. Now, in a positive sense for Donald Trump, this Mars has allowed him to have an air of confidence, he's able to take action. On the shadow side, this is also manifested as arrogance, combativeness, and anger, which we've seen plenty of times throughout his life. One natal planet that we do have to talk about is natal Mercury in cardinal water. This Mercury is out of bounds. Now, we know with Donald Trump, he's not afraid to say what's on his mind, whether you agree with him or not. This is an out of bounds planet past its declination and the authority of the sun. It's unscripted, it's not politically correct. And if we go back to 2015, for a segment of the population, for them, they found it refreshing. Now, with Mercury and the Saturn and the Venus, we're in cardinal water, we're in Cancer here, and there's an element of tribalism. So there is that segment of the population that resonated with Donald Trump back in 2015. And of course, through nearly the 10 years that he's been in the political sphere, he's speaking about this tribalism, this protectionism of the United States. And for many people, this has resonated. We're also in the 12th house here. Can his words get him into trouble? Absolutely. And we've seen that certainly in the last couple of years. Now, having stepped into the political ring nearly 10 years ago, many people argue politicians lie. But with Donald Trump, objectively, he has taken this to an art form, and it's pretty much on steroids. Now, if you look at this Mercury in the separating square to Neptune, it's not even on the same scale. I think the reports show over 30,000 lies or misleading quotes. So really, Donald Trump has taken lying and misleading to an art form. Tying into this energetic chart, we have Donald Trump with full moon energy. Quite interesting, as Kamala Harris has full moon energy as well. So it just gives this extra dynamism to this chart for Donald Trump. Another planet of note for Donald Trump is his natal Jupiter. This is quite a powerful Jupiter in his chart. It's in its own terms, setting its own agenda. It's got dignity by triplicity. And also you'll see here, it's at its station. Now, Donald Trump was born on June 14th, 1946. On June 15th, 1946, Jupiter stationed to go direct. Now, any planet stationing gives the planet extra oomph in a chart, and we can certainly see throughout Donald Trump's life how important Jupiter has been to him. It's ruling the 5th house, it's ruling the 8th house, and Donald Trump has lived a very privileged life. Now, Donald Trump claimed that his father only gave him $1 million to start out in life. Now, we know this is factually inaccurate. He actually came to inherit 8th house, hundreds of millions of dollars to start him out in life. What has also helped with a strong Jupiter is that Donald Trump has had no issues in his life borrowing from banks and borrowing money. I don't know how he's managed to do it. Maybe it's that Mercury-Neptune. But again, he's had no issues with being able to borrow money and large sums of money. Now, if we step back from this chart, we'll notice we've got a preponderance of planets in the 4th quadrant for Donald Trump. We have 7 planets sandwiched between the ascendant and the midheaven. And in this 4th quadrant, he spent most of his life out in public, out into society, where he wants his name mentioned everywhere. He has his names on all of his big buildings. And in fact, he gets rather upset when his name is not in the news. We can see in this chart that Sun is fairly powerful. It's conjunct the North Node, and also it meets all the planetary set conditions. So this is quite a powerful Sun where, again, he just wants to be out in public and to be seen. Now, I'm using whole sign charts today, but we can also look at this chart in a quadrant house system, say Placidus. We can also view the Sun North Node in the 10th house of, say, a Placidus system and the themes that manifest there. What's also interesting in this chart is we have Donald Trump's natal midheaven conjunct Algol in the terms of Saturn, and you can take that as you will. Lastly, if we're talking about this Mercury in the 12th house out of bounds, where his words get him into trouble, we can also look at the debilitated Saturn in the 12th, as well as Venus. And of course, many of his relationships in life have been a source of his downfall as well. And to compound those relationship issues, not only do we have the Venus conjunct Saturn, Saturn is debilitated, ruling the 7th house. And as we've seen throughout his life, he's had many issues in terms of romantic partnerships. In addition, we might also talk about the civil case with E.G. and Carroll. Now, let's look at a couple of solar returns. One of the advantages of astrology is we can look back to look forward to see what might come ahead. And one of the arguments I'm going to make today is that his solar return of 2016 was far more powerful than the current one he has this year. One significant part of this solar return is that we see the solar return ascendant is the same as the natal ascendant. Now, the degrees aren't lining up too closely, but anytime that you see a solar return where it's the same as your natal, if we look at the houses, the solar return in the inner wheel, the natal chart in the outer wheel, we are all lining up. And if you take a look at your own solar returns, it's usually a significant year. And through my experience, usually quite positive years. I'm going through one of those years right now, so keep an eye out for that as you're looking at your own solar returns. But for Donald Trump in 2016, this was a very strong chart. For Donald, this was an 11th house perfected year, which activates this Sun and Uranus. And what's interesting in the solar return is we have Uranus conjunct the solar return midheaven. And for many people, including astrologers at this time, it was a shock that Donald Trump became the next president of the United States. With Uranus, we can expect the unexpected. That's why no astrologer can predict what's going to happen with Uranus, because it's going to do its own thing and it's going to be wild and unpredictable. And for Donald Trump in 2016, the year theme was unexpected events relating to his public standing. And of course, he ended up becoming the next president of the United States. To compound the strength of this solar return, we've got the ruler of the midheaven, which is Mars, very strong in domicile. It's in an angular house, and it's conjunct his natal IC, making it a very strong Mars for this particular year. Now, yes, it's retrograde, but the overall condition of this Mars was very strong. And ruling the midheaven, it just spoke to me as a very significant year and a very powerful year as Donald Trump became the next president of the United States. Compounding the strength of this chart even further, we have Mercury, Lord of the Year, domicile in the 11th house. We have the Sun-Venus conjunction, so for a segment of the population who's very popular at this time, and we're all activated here with the solar return and the Sun in the 11th house. So he was going out giving speeches, he was out in public, it was part of his ambitions and goals to be the next president of the United States. And with the overall strength of this chart, that's exactly what manifested and exactly what happened. Adding to the power of this year and the strength of this solar return, we also had Donald Trump with his Jupiter return back in December of 2016, just reinforcing this theme of strength, good luck, good fortune. And this was very apparent for him through 2016 through to 2017. Okay, so going into Donald Trump's solar return for 2024 into 2025, we can see the difference here between the power of the solar return in 2016 and the current one that we have now. The difference with this year is that we have the solar return ascendant in the natal 12th house for Donald Trump. This solar return ascendant bringing up 12th house themes of sorrow, self-undoing, hidden enemies. He is now a convicted felon. We've got Lord of the Year in the 9th of law, conjunct the solar return midheaven. We have Saturn, Lord of the Year, squaring off some of these solar return planets. And what's compounding these 12th house themes is that we have a stellium of planets in the solar return 12th house, reinforcing the themes of self-undoing, hidden enemies. And part of the reason why this chart this year is not the same as 2016, And for me, my inclination is towards Donald Trump not becoming the next president of the United States. Yes, we have a strong Mercury in domicile, but for me, it's not within that minute of Cazimi. So this Mercury is very much combust, as well as this Venus. And as we have this combust Venus in the 12th house of the solar return, ruling the natal midheaven, I just can't see this being a year where he's elected president of the United States. To compound some of these issues with the solar return for 2024, we have the ruler of the solar return ascendant, the moon, in an applying opposition to this Saturn. So emotionally, this is going to be quite a heavy and difficult year, I would say, for Donald Trump, especially if he loses the presidential election. What's interesting as well is that we have some excellent astrologers who I highly respect talking about Donald Trump not even making the election. And what's interesting here is that we have the natal midheaven tightly conjunct the solar return Uranus. Now, as I've said before, no astrologer can predict the outcome with Uranus because it's upheaval, it's unpredictable. And I just find that curious of astrologers talking about Donald Trump not even making it to the election. I think for me, on balance, I'm not sure about that. On balance, I do believe Donald Trump will make it to the election. But again, with Uranus, expect the unexpected. So that would be really interesting if that was the case. Now, talking again about 12th house issues and the actions Donald Trump is taking at the moment, this Mars is not in great shape. I do find it interesting in terms of self-undoing that he's picked a very unpopular VP as his running mate. And maybe this was part of the natal arrogance and the ego, thinking to himself he was going to win this election in a landslide against Joe Biden. And maybe that cockiness has led him to make some questionable decisions, which could be ultimately his downfall in this election. What's also interesting to note with this solar return versus the solar return in 2016 is a lot of these planets are falling in cadent houses and doesn't really have the strength as it did in 2016. So in this, in combination with what's going on with the solar return, it just leading me towards this being a difficult year for Donald Trump. And again, part of my inclination towards him not becoming the next president of the United States. And unlike the solar return of 2016, the ruler of this midheaven is, yes, it's a benefic, but it's detriment in the 12th house. Now, that's part of the reason why I don't think this solar return is as strong as it was in 2016. Now, yes, we can take the Lord of the Year, Saturn, conjunct the midheaven as a sense of authority. I think how this is played out is that Donald Trump has that sense of authority. He's become the head of the Republican ticket. So maybe that's the answer for Saturn on the midheaven here with Lord of the Year. So like anything in life, we have positive and negative events. And for Donald Trump, certainly becoming the head of the Republican ticket has been a positive event for him. And like all of these videos I do, I'm looking through my own perspectives, picking out important themes I see. So if there's any important delineations I've missed, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts if you put them in the comments. Okay, so let's get to around Election Day 2024. With all of these charts here, we have the inner wheel as Donald Trump's natal chart. The second wheel out, we have secondary progressions. Third wheel, we have solar arc directions. And the outer wheel, we have the transits. Okay, so let's get to one obvious positive for Donald Trump is transiting going through the 11th house. This will be trining several times his natal Jupiter. This is definitely fortunate for Donald Trump in terms of good luck, good fortune, going through his 11th house of goals and ambitions. If you prefer looking at these charts in a quadrant house system, say Placidus, you might also call this transit through the 10th house of career for Donald Trump. So there's no getting away from this positive for Donald Trump. He's certainly going to be larger than life in the public arena. He's certainly going to have huge popularity with his supporters. But let me tell you why this time I think this is different. If we go back to 2016, Donald Trump had just gone through his Jupiter return. Now, for me, others may disagree. A Jupiter return is far more fortunate and powerful than a Jupiter in a nice aspect, say in a trine, which Donald Trump has got here. Another thing we've got to keep in mind is that just like Donald Trump in 2016, Kamala Harris has now just gone through her Jupiter return. So I think that's highly significant for her as she goes into the elections. And while there is no doubt this is a positive to Donald Trump, is this going to be enough to take him over the edge and to get him to the presidency? I'm leaning towards no. I also want to bring to your attention how fortunate and how powerful Donald Trump has been since the end of 2020. Now, if we look at all of these directed planets and the strength of these planets, I think this has played a major role in Donald Trump's success over the past few years. So at the end of 2012, we had a number of directed planets gaining strength. We had Saturn come through and gain its exaltation in Libra. We had Venus coming into its domicile, and Mars, which eventually went through into its domicile in fixed water. Now, even on election day, this is still the case for a number of these planets. We've got Venus ruling the natal midheaven. He's still well regarded with his base and his supporters. Now, there's something different happening here in 2024 that's caught my attention. If we go back through the last 30 years for the directed Jupiter of Donald Trump, and we know how powerful Jupiter is in his natal chart, had been its domicile for the best part of 30 years. Now, what's changed in the last 2 years at the end of 2022? Well, now directed Jupiter has gone into its fall. Now, is this going to be a fall from grace? Has Donald Trump's luck finally ran out? Compounding this shifting of tone, we have secondary progressed moon in fall for the best part of the last 9 months. You can see this with all of his legal woes and all of the issues he's been able to deal with. Emotionally, he's not been in a great place. And this is going to continue for the best part of just under 2 years. So some of these extra factors coming in is making me lean towards, as we get into 2025 and through 2024, as an emotionally difficult period for Donald Trump. And there's a part of me thinking that his luck is finally starting to run out. What is also interesting to note is that we have secondary progressed Mercury making its conjunction towards natal Mars. Now, maybe through an emotionally difficult time where he's losing that element of luck and the enthusiasm and the tides are going against him. Is this going to make him even more volatile and more angry as this progressed Mercury conjuncts his natal Mars? Now, to compound maybe some of this anger and grievance, on election day, we're going to have Mars ingress into fixed fire. Is this going to add to the anger and vitriol as it transits the first house? Now, what's interesting as we get to inauguration day, and I should have pulled up the chart for this, is that we're going to have transiting Mars turn retrograde and go back over natal Venus, Saturn. Now, Venus rules the natal midheaven. As Mars transits and goes back through and hits the Saturn-Venus natal conjunction, is this going to add to the anger and frustration he feels this time if he doesn't become elected the next president of the United States? There's one thing for sure, we can all expect some political violence around the time of the election and inauguration day, unfortunately. And we're going to have to keep an eye out for the collective response. Now, one thing I mentioned in our August forecast is I feel like this year into next year has a very Venusian feel, and the power of women coming out and voicing their opinions. Around election day, we're going to have transiting Venus. Now, Venus moves very fast. This only lasts for a day or two, but transiting Venus conjunct his natal south node and moon. Now, I feel for this election, if Kamala Harris is going to win, it's going to be the power of women that come out and vote. It's going to be the power of the young vote. It's going to be the power of minorities and people of color who come out to eventually end this MAGA chapter in American history. In addition, it'll be remiss of me not to mention the transiting Uranus going back and forth over his midheaven. We've seen that earlier in the year with the assassination attempt, as we had the Mars-Uranus conjunction square his natal ascendant. There's certainly no doubt that Donald Trump doesn't have an astrologer on his board of advisors. Every astrologer would say this is probably a good day to stay indoors. Now, going back to the 2024 solar return, we are reinforcing this theme of Uranus on the midheaven. Now, as I've said before, no astrologer can predict what Uranus will do. Some astrologers may argue, like it did in 2016, that some event might take place where he ends up somehow winning the presidency. But as I'm looking at all of these charts in combination, I don't see that myself. And as I've said before, I'm looking at these charts through my own lens and my own biases. And all essentially I am is a weatherman. I'm looking at the astrological weather, what might be coming ahead. Now, weathermen are not always correct. A weatherman might say to you there's 80% chance of rain tomorrow. So in that case, you might want to take an umbrella. The point I'm making here is that weathermen can be wrong. I could be wrong in these delineations. But if I'm looking at this is in terms of chances and looking at the charts, and you can see the video of Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, Putting all of these charts in combination, this is leading me towards a 70–75% chance of Kamala Harris winning the next election and becoming the next president of the United States versus the 25–30% for Trump, if I was going to leverage a percentage against it. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is there may be some caveats in terms of this election. And what I've got on the screen here is the very partisan Supreme Court of the United States, possible intervention and issues with state legislators. And this actually might be a good video moving forward to take maybe a look at if there's a chart for the Supreme Court and any charts for state legislators. So right now we're in unprecedented times with very damaging rulings coming out of the Supreme Court. We've had the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and you've seen the midterm elections and elections on the ballot where women have come out in strong numbers. And I feel like this is going to be the catalyst. If we're looking at that transit in Venus around election day, this is going to be the year of women where they come out in record numbers. And if they do, this will turn the tide. And I believe Kamala Harris will be the next president of the United States. But just keeping an eye out on these caveats with a very partisan Supreme Court of the United States and any fudgery, I won't swear on this video, any fudgery by any of the state legislators who might mess around in terms of certifying elections. And I've lived in the United States for over 12 years now, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. One other thing I did want to mention is Pluto having dipped its toes back into Capricorn. Now, part of my feeling is when we get into the inauguration in 2025, we're going to have that Sun-Pluto conjunction in Aquarius. Now, for me, if Kamala Harris wins the presidential election, are we then now in a period and a new period where, as she says on her campaign trail, we're not going back. We are not going back to the misogyny, the racism, the xenophobia that has clouded the skies for so many years. Are we now finally going to go into a new period for 20 or so years? Okay, so thank you all for watching. Of course, if there's any delineations I've missed, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. And here's a message for all the keyboard warriors out there. If you're going to make a rebuttal and going to make a statement, make it an astrological one. I don't need to spend my time with the all-cap letters misspelt and with the poor punctuation. So if you are going to make a comment and try and troll, at least make it a sensible argument with something valuable to say. Okay, I appreciate all you listening and watching this video. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Put them down in the comments below. I will be looking to do further videos on the Supreme Court and possibly state legislators, maybe also charts on VP picks. But by the time I get to that, I think Kamala Harris will certainly have picked hers. But what I can do is look at the combined charts of JD Vance and the possible pick for Kamala Harris. So again, thank you all for watching. I appreciate taking your time out of the day to watch these videos, and I'll be making some more videos in the future. Have a wonderful rest of your week and stay safe.